73 seconds. That's how long it took for 7 lives to change forever. Live on national television, in front of millions of schoolchildren. But here's what almost nobody knows. The crew cabin of the Challenger didn't vanish in that fireball everyone remembers. It kept flying. It kept climbing. And for nearly 3 minutes afterward, it fell back to Earth. And there's strong evidence that some of the astronauts were still alive for at least part of that fall. This is the story NASA never wanted to tell in detail. What actually happened to the 7 men and women aboard Challenger after the world stopped watching? Cape Canaveral woke up to an unusual cold snap that morning. Overnight temperatures had dipped into the mid-20s, and by launch time frost and ice clung to the gantry and the shuttle's external tank. It was far colder than any previous shuttle launch. Engineers had photographed icicles forming along the structure hours before liftoff. Despite the cold, and despite a mission that had already been delayed several times, NASA pressed forward. This was not an ordinary flight. Aboard Challenger was Krista McAuliffe, a social studies teacher from New Hampshire, chosen from over 10,000 applicants to become the first private citizen in space through NASA's Teacher in Space program. Because of her, classrooms across the country had their televisions tuned to the launch that morning. The crew of STS-51L was Commander Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialists Judith Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Ronald McNair, and payload specialists Gregory Jarvis and Krista McAuliffe. Between them, they represented the military, engineering, science, and education, a genuine cross-section of what the space program hoped to become. At 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time, Challenger lifted off from Launch Complex 39B. For the first minute of flight, everything looked routine. Families and reporters watched the shuttle climb higher into the blue Florida sky. Inside Mission Control, controllers called out normal velocity and altitude figures. Then, at 73 seconds into the flight, pilot Michael Smith was heard saying, "Oh," the last words recorded from the crew. A second later, at roughly 46,000 feet, the shuttle came apart. What people watching at home saw was a massive fireball, and most assumed the entire vehicle, crew included, had been destroyed instantly. That is not exactly what happened. The fireball was the external fuel tank rupturing and igniting its liquid hydrogen and oxygen. The orbiter itself was torn apart by extreme aerodynamic forces as it was suddenly exposed to airflow. It was never designed to survive intact, not by an explosion in the way people imagine. Here is the part of the story most documentaries skip past. The crew compartment, the sealed section of the shuttle where all 7 astronauts were strapped into their seats, broke away from the disintegrating orbiter largely in one piece. Investigators later determined it continued on an upward trajectory for roughly 25 more seconds, reaching an altitude of around 65,000 feet before gravity took over. From there, the cabin fell for approximately 2 minutes and 45 seconds before striking the Atlantic Ocean at a speed investigators estimated at over 200 miles per hour. At that velocity, hitting water is close to hitting solid ground. There was no possibility of survival at splashdown. The question that has haunted investigators, historians, and the astronauts' families for decades is a harder one. Were the crew members aware of what was happening during that fall? In the months after the accident, NASA conducted a detailed engineering and medical examination of the recovered crew cabin and its contents, separate from the Public Rogers Commission hearings on the technical cause of the disaster. Investigators found that several of the astronauts' personal egress air packs, emergency oxygen supplies mounted near their seats, had been manually activated. These packs did not turn on automatically. Someone had to physically reach the switch and activate the airflow. Finding several of them engaged told investigators that at least some crew members survived the initial breakup long enough to recognize an emergency and respond to it with trained, deliberate action. That does not mean they survived the entire fall consciously. At an altitude of 46,000 feet, cabin depressurization following the breakup would likely have caused unconsciousness within seconds for anyone not immediately on supplemental oxygen. Whether the activated air packs restored enough consciousness to last through the full descent is something investigators could not determine with certainty. NASA's official position, then and now, is that the exact physical and mental state of the crew during the fall cannot be definitively established from the physical evidence alone. What can be said, and what NASA did conclude, is that the astronauts' deaths were caused by the trauma of the ocean impact, not the initial structural breakup of the shuttle. In the hours after the disaster, the response shifted immediately to search and rescue. Coast Guard cutters and helicopters, along with Navy vessels already in the area for the mission, converged on the debris field. Within a day, officials acknowledged there was no realistic hope of survivors, and the operation formally became a search and recovery mission. It became one of the largest and most methodical debris recovery efforts NASA had ever undertaken. The debris field stretched across a wide area of ocean off the Florida coast. Recovery crews used sonar mapping and grid search patterns to comb the seafloor, sending divers down wherever significant wreckage was detected. Pieces large and small were brought up, photographed, logged, and transported to a secure hangar at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, where engineers began the painstaking work of reconstructing the shuttle to understand exactly how the breakup occurred. For more than 5 weeks, the crew cabin itself remained missing. Then, on March 7, 1986, sonar operators detected a large object on the ocean floor roughly 18 miles from the launch site, in about 100 feet of water. Divers confirmed it was the crew compartment. From that point forward, NASA treated the operation less as an engineering recovery and more as the recovery of 7 fallen crew members. A security perimeter was established around the site. Depress access was deliberately kept at a distance. NASA's leadership made a conscious decision that this phase of the operation would be handled with the same solemnity given to recovering military personnel killed in the line of duty. The remains were brought to the surface, transferred under close supervision, and moved to a secure facility for examination. Each family was assigned a military casualty assistance officer to serve as a point of contact and support throughout the identification process, a system borrowed directly from military protocols for handling combat casualties. In 1986, DNA identification was not yet standard practice. Identification relied instead on dental records, skeletal analysis, and personal effects recovered with the remains, methods that required time, patience, and a team of forensic pathologists and medical examiners working case by case. NASA's stated purpose for this examination was twofold. First, to identify each crew member individually, so they could be properly returned to their families. Second, to gather what medical evidence could reasonably be gathered about the final moments of the flight, in hopes that any lessons learned might improve crew safety systems for future missions. NASA never released the detailed findings of this examination to the public. The agency's reasoning, consistently maintained since 1986, was that specific medical details would serve no meaningful public purpose and would only add pain for the families involved. Over the years, some information became known through journalists, subsequent investigations, and statements from officials involved in the process, which is how the broader outline of what happened has become public knowledge. But NASA itself has never published a full account. While the recovery and identification process was underway, President Reagan appointed a commission chaired by former Secretary of State William Rogers to determine what caused the disaster. The commission's investigation was extensive. Hundreds of witnesses interviewed, thousands of documents reviewed, and public hearings where NASA officials and contractor engineers testified about the decisions leading up to launch. The technical cause turned out to be a rubber O-ring seal in the right solid rocket booster. In cold temperatures, the rubber lost the flexibility it needed to seal the joint between booster segments properly. Hot gases escaped through that joint, burned into the external fuel tank, and triggered the structural failure that destroyed the shuttle. But the Commission's report placed just as much weight on the human and organizational failures behind that O-ring failure. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the solid rocket boosters, had raised concerns the night before launch about performance in cold weather, based on data from earlier flights showing O-ring problems at lower temperatures. They recommended against launching. In a teleconference with NASA managers, those concerns were pushed back on, and under pressure, Thiokol's own management ultimately reversed its engineers' recommendation and approved the launch. The Rogers Commission concluded this reflected a broader pattern at NASA, A culture where warning signs from earlier flights had gradually become normalized rather than treated as red flags, and where schedule pressure had, over time, eroded the agency's own safety standards. The shuttle program was grounded for nearly 3 years. Following the disaster, NASA redesigned the solid rocket booster joints and added heaters to prevent the cold weather failure that doomed Challenger. The agency restructured its safety oversight, created new independent safety review positions, and worked to build a culture where engineers could raise concerns without being overruled by schedule pressure. When Discovery lifted off in September 1988 on their return-to-flight mission, its crew carried a memorial banner honoring the Challenger astronauts. The shuttle program continued for another 23 years, though NASA would face similar questions about organizational complacency again after the loss of Columbia in 2003. A reminder that some lessons have to be relearned. After identification was complete, the crew's remains were released to their families for private burial. Commander Scobie, Pilot Smith, Judith Resnick, and Gregory Jarvis were laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery. Ellison Onizuka's ashes were interred at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Hawaii. Ronald McNair was buried in South Carolina, and Krista McAuliffe in New Hampshire, close to the community and students she taught. Some personal items recovered from the cabin, rings, watches, photographs, were identified among the wreckage and returned to the families. The crew cabin itself, once the investigation concluded, was buried at sea, in a location NASA has kept confidential. The decision, made in consultation with the families, was meant to prevent the site from becoming a target for divers or souvenir hunters, protecting it as what it truly was, a final resting place. The rest of the recovered shuttle debris remains stored today in decommissioned missile silos at Cape Canaveral, preserved for historical and research purposes, but not open to the public. Today, the 7 Challenger astronauts are remembered at the Space Mirror Memorial at Kennedy Space Center, at Arlington, and through schools, buildings, and scholarships bearing their names across the country. But the most significant memorial isn't a physical monument at all. It's the changes NASA made afterward. Redesigned hardware, restructured safety oversight, and a culture that, at least for a time, took engineers' warnings seriously again. The story of what happened to the Challenger crew after the breakup is a difficult one to tell. It complicates the clean, heroic image most people carry of that mission. But telling it honestly is part of how their sacrifice continues to matter. 3 of the 7 had manually activated emergency air supplies. That single detail tells us they were aware, however briefly, that something had gone catastrophically wrong, and that even in those final moments, they were doing exactly what their training had prepared them to do. Trying to survive. They didn't get the outcome they deserved, but the failures that killed them were studied, understood, and in large part corrected. Changes that have protected the astronauts who flew after them. Almost 4 decades later, the Challenger crew is remembered not only for how they died, but for who they were. A commander, a pilot, engineers, a physicist, and a teacher who believed that reaching further into the unknown was worth the risk. The final lesson of Challenger isn't the fireball everyone remembers watching. It's what came after, the accountability, the redesign, and the quiet, ongoing responsibility of making sure 7 lives were not lost for nothing.